variation. Say that variation is a core component that you can't explain the answer to the question without variation. The second component is inheritance. The third component is something called differential survival and reproduction. Differential survival and reproduction. And then the fourth one, they identified as being adaptation. This has been developed over many, many years. But just like you did for yours, I'm going to give a brief description of what each one is, and then we'll get into the connections here. So variation, in this model, they describe it as meaning that I'm going to zoom in here. Individuals in a population differ in some trait of interest. We're going to see this phrase over and over in this model, and all that means is every story that you've heard, there's been a particular trait that's being studied. And it's also the trait that is relevant to what's going on in the story. So, pretty straightforward. That the assumption is that in every situation of traits changing, that individuals in a population, they differ in some trait of interest. There's variation. Okay. The second component, they describe as meaning that the trait of interest must at least be partially inherited from parents or the prior generation. As you write that, you might be wondering what does it mean to have something partially inherited? Well, so one area that this model, you can kind of draw a little dotted line to connect here. That idea of partially inherited, this includes things like behavior, right? So something like beak depth, it's inherited from the parents. But something like behavior, like group behavior, they're saying might be partially inherited. There might be some genetic elements to it, but then also some environmental influences on a behavior. But it has to at least have some kind of partial inheritance. All right, we good so far? Now, let's talk about this one. So, differential survival and reproduction, the way that it's described is that some individuals zoom in here. With a particular form or forms of the trait of interest are more likely to survive and reproduce than others in the population. Right? That there is this differential survival and reproduction. And then in parentheses here, this is the longest one, that this idea of which form or forms of the trait causes an individual to be more likely, this is based on the environmental conditions. The last one, we'll talk about some connections here. So adaptation, the way that they define it here, is that adaptation means that the frequency of the forms or form of the trait of interest that increase survival and reproduction becomes higher in the population. I want you to notice that that term adaptation, in the description, there's nothing about learning, there's nothing about reacting to the environment. Because when you and I might use the term adapt or adaptation, like somebody adapted to a hard situation, that means that they kind of like learned from their experience, changed something, and then were able to improve. Notice the difference here is that the definition, all it says is that the frequency of that form or form of the trait becomes higher. So what that means is that adaptation is not, this is a key point here, adaptation is not an individual effort. Adaptation is a population change. Everybody say that? Adaptation is not an individual effort, it's a population change, at least in this model. All right. So we got these four elements. Let's talk about some connections here. Because you might be wondering, okay, well, what about mutation? Mutation we talked about a lot. What about generation or competition or environmental change, right? Those are all core elements of a lot of your models. Where does that fit in here? And so what we're going to see is that the connections between them, that's where these get included. So the first connection we're going to talk about, right here, between variation and inheritance. So variation and inheritance, they say that variation comes from two things. Random mutation and sexual reproduction. and is passed down. Right? So we're talking about variation coming from random mutation, which occurs during reproduction. But then something we haven't talked about is how sexual reproduction actually increases variation even more. We're going to talk about that in the next part of this unit. All right, so we've talked about random mutation, but we will talk about sexual reproduction in the next part. Okay. Other connection here. Variation and differential survival. It's meant to be read. So the connection here is that some variations increase what's known as fitness of an individual. And this can be taken to mean as kind of the ability to compete, to survive and reproduce. Some variations, they increase the fitness of an individual, their ability to compete. So there's competition. Okay. Talk about a few more here. The connection between here and here, right down the middle, is that variations that help individuals survive and reproduce they get passed down more frequently, simply because of that differential survival and reproduction. So they're going to get inherited or passed down more frequently. The last two here that we're going to talk about: inheritance and adaptation. So inheritance and adaptation, so as this gets passed down more frequently, what's going to happen is that over time and generations, the frequency of variations in the population changes. Right, so think Finch story. Over time, generations, the frequency of the beat depth variations changed. Right, but it took time as those genes were passed down and inherited over generations. Okay. And the last thing is this connection right here at the bottom. That connection right there. Is that differential survival and reproduction and adaptation, right? These two kind of leading to each other. Again, this is specific to the competition that exists in a specific environment. Right? Meaning that the adaptation to a particular area of competition in environments might not be beneficial in a different environment. Right? Adaptations, they don't transfer. are more connections that we could draw here, but those are kind of the big ones that we can use to explain each story. Are there any questions or things that you need me to clarify? Okay. What I'd like you to do is I want you to take about a minute with your table. What similarities do you see between this and what you made as a group? And then what were some things on this that maybe weren't necessarily in your model? Okay, so take a few moments, and then we'll come back in about a minute. Take about 20 more seconds, and similarities and differences. So what's on the screen and what you made at your table. So, we're going to do one more thing before we take our second break, but while you were talking, I handed out a little table, and it says, developing an explanation. Looks like this. Now, what this is I went in and typed out a lot of the key pieces that I talked about here. The reason I did a map here in addition to the table is that in the table you can't necessarily see how each of the four connect to each other, as you can with this. Okay? But this right here is actually going to be a tool that we're going to use to explain every story that we hear about traits changing from here on out. Right, see where it says evidence on the right-hand column? Yeah? So, I want you to put one bullet point in each box, just like I did right there. Now, if you skim through the description, you'll see a lot of similarities between what I wrote and what's on the table. And what I want you to do, for our last thing before we take a break, is I want you to spend about 3 minutes at your table and remind yourself of the Finch story. When thinking about the Finch story, I want you to actually write a one-sentence piece of evidence that connects to each of the four components. Right? So the first one I'll do with you. One piece of evidence of variation in the Finch story was that there were many different types, you can copy this down, of beak depths before and after the drought occurred. We have evidence of that, which are these graphs showing the variation. That's my evidence from the Finch story. So what I want you to do at your table is next to inheritance, differential survival, and adaptation, can you write just like a one-sentence piece of evidence from the story, the Finch story, that connects to each of those components? complicated table, but we'll come back in about 3 minutes to debrief, and then we'll take a break.